Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the prophecy of Hosea and chapter 1. If we are going to try and understand what is happening in the world, then a little bit of historical background is always useful. And so, for example, if we want to understand recent events in Afghanistan, then a look back 20 years to the events of 9/11 might help us to appreciate how and why the Western military forces came to be in that country. And if we then want to understand how the terrorist groups that came and carried out the attacks of 9/11, if we want to know how they came into existence, then a look even further back to the 1980s and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan might help shed some light on that one. A look back over history can often help us to understand what's happening in the world. And likewise, a look back over history can often help us to understand what's happening in the writings of the Old Testament prophets. I say that because the Old Testament prophets, they were not writing or speaking in a historical vacuum. They didn't just wake up one morning and think to themselves, I wonder what I'll post on the internet today. No, they were sent by God, and they were commissioned by God, and they were inspired by God to address a particular people in a particular historical situation. And if we understand a little bit of that historical situation, then it will help us enormously in our understanding of what the prophets said to the people back then, and that will help us to understand the message of the prophets for us today. And so here goes with a whistle-stop tour of the Old Testament. I do promise it will be very brief, but here's a whistle-stop tour of the Old Testament in order to get a little bit of the historical background. Way back in the 12th chapter of Genesis, God calls a man called Abraham and promises to make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. By the time you reach the end of Genesis, Abraham's descendants numbered 70, and they're living in the land of Egypt. Although they were initially welcomed in Egypt, the situation changed, and they not only became a much bigger group of people, they also became an oppressed and an enslaved group of people. But God hadn't forgotten those promises that he made to Abraham. And so the book of Exodus, we're now into the second book of the Bible already, the book of Exodus records how God miraculously rescued his chosen people out of Egypt. As we hear God saying in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Having rescued them out of Egypt, God brought them into the land of Canaan, recorded for us in the book of Joshua, a land that had been promised to Abraham many years previously. The book of Judges explains how they had a rather bumpy start to their time within the promised land, but following the appointment of a king in 1 and 2 Samuel, their situation became much more settled and much more secure, especially during the reign of King David. Following his death, Solomon, his son, took the throne. And it was during his reign that the temple was built, and it was during his reign that the nation of Israel became highly respected throughout the world. But sadly, following the death of Solomon in the 10th century BC, things were never quite the same again. As 1 Kings 12 indicates, many within Israel resented the appointment of Solomon's son and resented his rule. The result being that there was a major split within the nation. And from 1 Kings 12 onwards, if you're reading Old Testament history, it's vitally important to remember that from that point on, the nation has split. The two southern tribes remained under the rule of David's descendants, and they were known as the Kingdom of Judah. They had Jerusalem as their capital. While the 10 northern tribes, they appointed their own king, and they were known as the Kingdom of Israel, and they had Samaria as their capital. And there is that northern kingdom of Israel, that Hosea was sent to with his God-given message, and they certainly needed it. You see, no sooner had the northern kingdom of Israel been constituted and their religion degenerated into syncretistic idolatry. You can read about it in 1 Kings 12, 13. They stopped worshipping the true and the living God who had rescued them from Egypt many years previously, and they worshipped false pagan deities instead. And although God sent them prophets to warn them of what the consequences of this would be, they continued in their idolatry. That's why we read in the next verse of Hosea chapter 11, verse 2, we read, "But the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images." That is the tragic history. That is the tragic historical and religious context that the prophet Hosea was sent to address in the second half of the 8th century BC. And the first thing we see as he does so is in verses 1 to 3 in chapter 1, and there we see the shock of a promiscuous marriage. The shock of a promiscuous marriage. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament prophets, then you will know that some of them were sent by God into some pretty difficult and challenging and awkward situations. And so, for example, Jonah, you know the story of Jonah, he was sent by God to a wicked foreign capital, the city of Nineveh, and he was sent there to preach a message of coming judgment. Daniel, you may remember, he found himself challenging and disobeying the most powerful person on the planet. But of all the prophets, none of them, I think it's fair to say, none of them found themselves in the horrible situation that Hosea was told to enter. Did you notice it? Verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness." The NIV, if you're using it, the NIV has gone for the more polite translation of verse 2. If you've got an ESV, or if you've got an authorized version, you'll see that it more accurately reads, "Take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom." One interpretation says that the Lord is describing what Hosea's wife would become. But the better interpretation is to take it as this is what she already was. In other words, Hosea is being told to marry a prostitute and to have children through her prostitution. Can you imagine how Hosea must have felt on hearing those words? If Jonah's heart missed a beat on receiving his commission from the Lord, then I suspect Hosea's missed 10 beats. Imagine being told, "Go and marry a whore." And if that instruction shocks you this evening, if it shocks you, then it's done its job. It's done its job. And I say that because the reason God gave this instruction to Hosea was so that it might shock the people of his day. He's been given this commission so that by taking a prostitute as a wife, he might make people sit up and take note. Can you imagine what happened as Hosea implements this instruction from the Lord? And as we are told in verse 3, he married Gomer, daughter of Diblin. Can you imagine what the talk of that town would be? Two Israelites chatting at the bus stop. The one says to the other, "Oh, by the way, have you heard the news?" "What news?" "The young eligible bachelor called Hosea is getting married." "Is he? Oh, that's wonderful news." Yes, it would be wonderful if he was marrying someone else. Why? Who's he marrying? He's marrying Gomer, the prostitute. It would certainly be the talk of the town, and possibly the talk of the whole region, and it was meant to be so. It was meant to be so. It was meant to be so that people might be shocked and think to themselves, what on earth is he doing that for? What has got into the guy? Why on earth is he choosing her for his wife? And if that's what you're wondering this evening, if that's the question you've asked, then just listen to the explanation that God gives in verse 2. "Take to yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." Or as the ESV says, "For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." Throughout both Old and New Testaments, and this is vitally important if we're going to understand the book of Hosea, throughout both Old and New Testaments, God's relationship to his people is viewed as a marriage relationship. In both Old and New Testaments, God is the husband and his people are his bride. And when his people forsake him in favour of other gods, the Bible describes that not only as idolatry, which it was, but the Bible also describes that as adultery. And what the recent history of the Northern Kingdom has demonstrated is that in taking Israel to be his bride, God has not merely married a bride who has been unfaithful once, or even twice. Instead, he has married a bride who has turned out to be a spiritual prostitute. That is the shock of a promiscuous marriage. And the reason Hosea has been told to marry this promiscuous woman is so that he might confront the professing people of God, not only in word, but also in action, so that he might confront them with the effects which their idolatrous track record has had on their relationship with God. And the reason his marriage to that promiscuous woman is recorded on the pages of our Bible is so that many years later, we too, as the professing people of God in our day, might realize the seriousness of our idolatry. And in response, you may be thinking to yourself, what idolatry? I've never sacrificed to the Baals or burned incense to images as they did back then. And so where has the idolatry been in my life? You may be thinking to yourself, and you're right. You probably haven't bowed down to a Baal or to a Buddha. But has there not been times when we've allowed other things and other people to come in and to occupy the place, the rightful place of God within our lives? Has there not been other things and other people whom you've allowed to occupy that supreme place of authority and allegiance and affection within your life, which rightfully belongs to God and to God alone? Has there not been times when we have forsaken the Lord in favour of them, living to please them rather than living to please Him, making them our priority in life rather than making Him our priority in life? I suspect that if we've been honest this evening, we would have to confess that there have been such occasions of idolatry in our lives, perhaps more frequent than we've realised. And what we must never forget is that such idolatry, because of our marriage relationship to God, such idolatry in biblical terms is also viewed as spiritual adultery. You see, our idolatry has not merely been the breaking of it has not merely been the breaking of an impersonal commandment which says, Exodus chapter 20 verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me." It has also been the forsaking of a personal God. And therefore it is probably fair to say that the shocking marriage of Hosea chapter 1 has continued to be an appropriate picture. That's why it's recorded in the pages of our Bible. It's continued to be an appropriate picture of the relationship between God and His professing people. That is the shock of a promiscuous marriage. Moving on, secondly, verses 4 to 9, the dangers of a persistent rebellion. The dangers of a persistent rebellion. Now, from what we read in the rest of the chapter, it appears that the Lord would not only get his message across through Hosea's marriage to Gomer, he would also get his message across through the names of Hosea's children. For example, having had their first child, Hosea and Gomer are told by God to call him Jezreel. Isn't it a lovely name, Jezreel? Well, just in case that's a name that sounds quite appealing to you, what we have to remember is that to Israelite ears, that would have sounded like Hiroshima, or Auschwitz, or Dunblane does to us. And the reason I say that is because Jezreel was the name of a place associated with horrendous bloodshed in Israel's history. And that's why we hear God providing this explanation in verse 4, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Now, according to 2 Kings 10, Jehu was fulfilling a God-given role at Jezreel in that he destroyed the wicked house of Ahab. But both his descendants and the northern kingdom as a whole are going to be punished by God for the ruthless attitude and the bloodthirsty actions which the massacre at Jezreel epitomised and which has characterised their entire history. Rather than turn a blind eye to their love with bloodshed, rather than turn a blind eye to it, God is going to hold them to account for it. So much so that he's going to put an end to the northern kingdom. Verse 4. He's going to put an end to the kingdom. That's the significance of the name Jezreel. Now, what is interesting is that the closing words of verse 3 explicitly say that in the birth of Jezreel, Gomer was bearing Hosea a son. That language is not used concerning the next two children. All that is said in verse 6 is that Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and it may well be that the second and third of these children were the children of unfaithfulness referred to in verse 2, i.e. it is as a result of her continuing prostitution that Gomer conceives her second and third child, and yet in obedience to God's commandment in verse 2, Hosea takes them to himself. And having done so, he's told by God to call his daughter Lo Ruhamah, which if you've got an NIV, you'll see in the footnote, means not loved. Not loved. Imagine calling your little baby girl not loved. Can you imagine Hosea going to collect his children at the school gate? All the other parents are calling out to their children things like, sweetie, darling, cutie, my loved one, let's go. And there is Hosea calling out, not loved, come here. It certainly will get people's attention, that's for sure. And you know what? It was supposed to. It was supposed to. Because as God goes on to explain in verse 6, call her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel that I should at all forgive them. No sooner had Lo Ruhamah been weaned and Gomer conceived again, this time it's a boy, and we hear God saying to Hosea in verse 9, call him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And so through the promiscuous nature of Hosea's marriage, God was highlighting the seriousness of Israel's behaviour. Through the names of Hosea's children, God is highlighting the danger of them persisting in such behaviour. He's doing so because one of the things which characterised these people, do you know what it was? It was complacency. Complacency. Historical and religious complacency. They assumed that because they had such a privileged past, and in my whistle stop tour, I hope you got an impression of just how privileged that past was. But they assumed that just because they had such a privileged past, they could live as they liked in the present and still be safe and secure in the future. And sadly, you still find historical and religious complacency of that type today. You still find it today. You sometimes find it in people who have grown up in a certain country or culture. Wales being one of them. A country or culture which has known a privileged religious history or heritage. And you sometimes find people who think because of that religious past, privileged past, they can live as they like in the present and will still be perfectly safe and secure in the future. You sometimes find such complacency amongst people brought up in Christian homes. You sometimes find it amongst people who have been baptized, either as infants or as teenagers. You may find it amongst people whose name is on a church membership roll. People who attended and perhaps even taught in Sunday school in the past. People who have been associated in some way with the Lord's people throughout their lives. People who have put up their hands, said a prayer, or gone forward at an evangelistic meeting of some kind. Such people can sometimes think that their privileged past allows them to live as they want in the present without affecting their safety or security in the future. But the names of Hosea's 3 kids challenges such complacency. I say that because there was no one on the face of the planet back then with a more privileged past than the people of Israel. And yet Hosea's 3 kids were a warning to them, and a warning to us many years later. A warning that regardless of how pleasant or privileged our past may have been, we are responsible and will be held accountable for how we live in the present. Jezreel. And should we persist in our adulterous rebellion towards God, should we persist in such behaviour, then as Lo Ruhamah and Lo Ami warn us, we may very well discover one day that we were not loved by God as we thought we were, and did not belong to the people of God as we assumed we had. That is the warning that these 3 kids present concerning the dangers of a persistent rebellion. Thirdly and finally, the hope of a promised future. The hope of a promised future. And you have that from verse 10 through to chapter 2, verse 1. Now, this opening chapter of Hosea serves not only as an introduction to the book, but it also in some ways serves as a summary for the whole book. And so the themes which crop up in this opening chapter are themes that crop up throughout the remainder of the book. And amongst those recurrent themes is this theme of hope. And you might think, hope? Where did that come from all of a sudden? There certainly hasn't been much hope up until now. But you look at verse 10. In verse 10, we hear God saying, "Yet the Israelites will be like the sea on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted." And on hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself, but hang on a minute, I thought we read back in verse 4 that the kingdom of Israel was going to come to an end. Was that just an empty threat on God's part? If not, then why are we hearing of this glorious future for Israel now here in verse 10? Well, let me emphasize that what we read in verse 4 certainly wasn't an empty threat, and history demonstrates that. Having persisted in her rebellion, the northern kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians, the great superpower, the Assyrians. It was overrun by the Assyrians in the year 722 BC, a mere 20 or 30 years at the most after the warnings of this chapter were delivered. And so it was no idle threat. But although the northern kingdom of Israel would face its end in 722 BC, although it would cease to exist, that does not mean that God's promises to have a special people would come to nothing. It doesn't mean that at all. No, his promises concerning his people would be fulfilled. He's a faithful God who fulfills his promises. And his promises concerning his people would be fulfilled. And that's why we hear God saying in verses 10 and 11, in the place where it was said, "You are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader." And so in spite of Israel's persistent rebellion, God's promises concerning his people would be fulfilled. The question is, how? How? Well, if you look back to verse 1, you'll see that Hosea's ministry, it spanned a period of time, and it spanned the reigns of 4 kings within the southern kingdom of Judah, the last of those being Hezekiah. And those of us who were here during the summer as we were working our way through 2 Chronicles, you may remember that one of the great things that Hezekiah did was that he reunited the true trusting people of God from both southern and northern kingdoms. He reunited them in their worship of God. It was a great achievement described for us in 2 Chronicles 30. And so God continued to have a worshipping people from both northern and southern kingdoms. And it's reasonable to assume that it was they who, or the descendants of them, who many years later would eventually be taken into exile in Babylon, but then would return from exile later. And so the promises of God concerning his people would continue to be fulfilled. But even if what I've just said, even if that is a partial and temporal fulfillment of these words at the close of Hosea chapter 1, please note, that's not the fulfillment that the New Testament writers draw our attention to. As we discovered in our first scripture reading this evening, Paul quotes from these closing verses of Hosea chapter 1 in Romans 9 when he says this in verse 26 of that chapter. He says, "It will happen that in the very place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' they will be called sons of the living God." And if you look at the context, of Romans 9, and if you're not familiar with it, then I would encourage you to read the first 8 chapters of Romans in order to understand what Paul is saying in Romans 9. And if you read that context, you will see that the point that Paul is making in that passage in Romans 9 is that people who were at one time not the people of God will become children of God. And the people he's referring to there in Romans chapter 9, please note, it's not a reconstituted northern kingdom of Israel, but it's people like you and me, from every nation under the sun, Gentile people who believe the gospel of Jesus Christ. As Paul says a couple of verses earlier in verse 24, even us, whom he also called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles, as he says in Hosea. And so, although the northern kingdom of Hosea's day were told in verse 9, "You are not my people," the promises of God concerning his people will still stand. Because in the gospel of Jesus Christ, God is still calling to himself a special people. A people of whom it was once said, "You are not my people." That's you and I, Gentiles by nationality. We were not part of that great privileged people that you read about throughout Old Testament history. We were strangers and foreigners to the covenants of promise. We were without Israel, outside of Israel. We were without hope and without God in this world. People of whom it was once said, "You are not my people." Through the gospel of Jesus Christ, they are a people who will be, as it said, like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be counted, verse 10. A people consisting of people from Jewish and Gentile background, verse 11, united under the leadership and the kingship of one person. And that person is Jesus Christ. That is the hope of a promised future. It is in the person and through the work of Jesus Christ that the solemn and the frightening words of verse 9 undergo a glorious reversal. Did you notice that? Yes, in verse 9, the people of Hosea's day were told, "You are not my people." But having taken 8 chapters to explain the great work of redemption that Jesus has accomplished in his birth, life, death, and resurrection, Paul can say in verse 10 that those who are not my people will be called sons of the living God. And so God's promises concerning his people will be fulfilled. In spite of Israel's idolatry and adultery, God will have his people. And here is the great news tonight, through trusting in Jesus Christ and his sufficient and completed work on the cross, you and I can belong to that people. Through trusting in him, you and I can become sons and daughters of the living God. People whose track record within our lives and throughout history has been a hopeless one. Through faith in Jesus Christ, we can become children of the living God. That is the great hope of a promised future. Yes, God has promised that he will have a people, and he has promised a glorious future for his people. And through believing his promises and trusting in his Son, you and I can belong to that privileged and promised people. 3 lessons from the opening chapter of Hosea. Firstly, we see the shock of a promiscuous marriage. Secondly, we see the dangers of a persistent rebellion. And thirdly, we see the hope of a promised future.